Mr. Farrakhan, mainly outside of America and sometimes in America. I wanted to weigh in on the discussion. I really appreciate the words of Dr. Winbush and Dr. Conrad Worrell. And there's a part, if you get an opportunity to get this, and they did an excellent job to show you the roots and the movement of the reparation movement. In 1961, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had an international paper called Muhammad Speaks, a paper that Jamaica under Shearer banned in the country, and it wasn't until Michael Manley came in that that ban was lifted. But in the paper, on the back of the paper, he had what the Muslims want. And as a spiritual man that didn't confine himself to the mosque, he confined himself as a spiritual man to the issues that we were confronted by as black people, not only in America, but throughout the world. He has in it a reparations platform that many people don't see it as that because he doesn't mention the word reparation. But in it, he talks about land, that America should give us land. He named 5 states that should be given to us, meaning that we cannot get along with them in peace. And at this time, they were still lynching us, and our men were being sent to prison. We were suffering in the community. Recently, since you've been here, you probably, if you turned on the television, you saw a black man outside of Washington, D.C. in Prince George County that suffered, him and his 7 children were killed by the gas stove that they were using. And the company came in and took his meter out of the house, saying it was an illegal meter. Now, some people looked at it, said, what a shame, and dismissed it. But it shows you the condition of black America, how we are suffering after slavery, and they always talk about a piece of the pie. This man lost 7 children and his own life trying to keep them warm in the winter. And what kind of circumstances is that for the richest country in the world? So the Honorable Elijah Muhammad had 2 parts on there that Minister Farrakhan has now put in the final call. And the first is the 5 states. The second is that they should give us money to get us started so that we could build this land of our own. If we cannot get along with them in peace, we should be separated. Abraham Lincoln and those who are the scholars and do the research, there's a book on Abraham Lincoln called Lincoln and the Negro. And Abraham Lincoln, who himself was basically racist, though you give him the credit of freeing the Negroes and so forth, but he said that it is obvious, and he brought in what was considered the Negro leaders at that time. He said it is obvious that the 2 of us cannot exist together in peace. And he talked to them about separation. He recommended Central America, you know, where you have today Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, in those areas. And he said that the area was compatible to the environment that they were brought out of Africa. But because they were not enlightened, they said to Lincoln, we don't want to go nowhere. We want to stay here with you. And so people have to be enlightened. And I'm saying this, it's about the reparation movement. The work with the Caribbean nations and the movements in the Caribbean is essential. But people have to be enlightened. The masses of our people do not understand reparation. In 1983, somebody from Chicago, Conrad, Gilbert White, I think his name is, I've gone through my library that I'm trying to liquidate of 3,000 books. He wrote a book called The Negotiation. Now, it is a novel, and I must say that you remember him?
Yes, he's a good friend of mine. He's one of my mentors.
Okay. It is an excellent book. Now, he wrote this in 1983, but because the push for reparations, the conversation in the intellectual circles for reparations, an example of it is that if there's a company that brought slaves into the Caribbean and used chains, and their ships were made in Rhode Island, in Newport, Rhode Island, where they laid out slave ships. If they used those slave ships to bring slaves into the Caribbean, then we both should jointly attach those companies, and those companies were pushed down. You read something that Malcolm quoted in Paris. Those companies, many of them, still exist today. So in this book, he wrote about separation, that the people had reached a point with the mistreatment, the prisons, and so forth. And white folks began to realize that the two could not exist together. Some of us love them so much you don't want to go nowhere. I need to stay close to them. I need to stay close to them because if I'm going to be successful, I got to get along with them. And that's right, our house is burning down when his house is burning. So they had to find someone who could negotiate for separation. Excellent novel. But he wrote it at a time that the movement in America was calling for a movement away from trying to integrate. Martin Luther King says, I fear that I'm integrating my people into a burning house. His words to Harry Belafonte. And so this is the reality today. But how do we push the proposition of reparation? It has to be pushed to the young people. We have to have reparation study groups on the campuses instead of these fraternities and sororities and what they're doing in them. But we need to go around and encourage young people to study reparations. We have to, one of the last things that I want to say, that we have to show that the killing of these young people in America and the imprisoning of black men mainly, but now there's a tremendous woman population in jail, and many of them are convicted on trumped up charges. The Justice Department just told the whole country that police departments are run on profiling black people and giving them tickets and putting them in jail to make fines to run their whole city.
That's right.
This is a case for reparation. They need to free the people, they need to take the warrants off them, and they need to pay the communities that have financed them killing our young people. So reparation has a place in it, but we got to preach it to this young generation. We got to give them this history that you laid out. We have to be able to show them the importance to get on this so that we can change the miserable reality that millions of black people live in America and in the Caribbean. Thank you very much.
I want to call on now, and by the way, the interventions need to be shorter. They need to be tighter, all right, so we can get more voices in, and we have a limited time span, so excellent, powerful, but more succinct. Salim Adolfo has been working on these issues, and let me just give you an order from this point on. While you're getting the microphone, I want to ask Brother Cam Howard to make an intervention around the work of NCOBRA. I would like then that to be followed by a brief intervention by Nkechi Taifa and Roger Wareham around legal strategies, some of the issues that came up around the legal strategies, because we know that this has been raised this morning in terms of some of the issues that the CARICOM Commission is working on. Yvette Modestine does a tremendous amount of work with African descendants throughout the hemisphere, and there may be some intersectionality in terms of how that work fits. I'd like to have her make a brief intervention. And then finally, Dr. Iva Carruthers, I'd like for her to address the issue of historical memory, the whole issues relating to some of the stuff that Reverend Jackson talked about last night in terms of how reparation fits around this issue of the lost graveyards, the lost monuments and so forth, because I know you have been talking about that. So I know we didn't get everybody in, but we need to and make those interventions short, because then we want to open it up for questions from the CARICOM Commission, and then we're going to keep rolling that way. So make these interventions tight. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. May I have permission from the elders to continue, please?
What if I said no?
Then I won't continue.
Go ahead.
You got to forgive me. It's hard to speak on reparations right after my beloved National Chairperson Emeritus, Dr. Conrad Worrell, but I'm going to try to do my best. I can't come to New York without mentioning the name Baba Jitu Ayusi. who's also an elder of mine and an ancestor, and Baba Seydou and Joya, who's the worker. After listening to all of the things that everybody said, I'm sitting here asking Mama and Kichi about some strategies that we can employ. So she said, you got to go ahead and say some of these things. But I do want to say that the National Black United Front has been trying to continue to bring the issue of reparations on the college campus. I've had Dr. Wimbush come to Howard twice within the last year, and we've had some good conversations, even in the blizzards and in the snow. We still managed to get a good number of students to come on out. But I think that what I'm saying, and this is no disrespect to a lot of the elders in the room, but you're not going to be around in another 50 to 40 years. And I apologize for having to say that, but that's the reality that we're faced with. So we have to find a way to engage some of the people in my generation and younger. And I think that one of the things that I'm noticing is that, like Dr. Worrell said, is that we've seen some good organizing tactics and strategies in some other movements. And I think if we can find a way to connect the reparations movement with the Black Lives Matter movement, that we'll be able to get some of that energy with some of the younger folks. And I know that some of the things that we've been able to do in Washington, D.C. with D.C. Ferguson is to bring some of these same issues and try to connect them, but I do recognize that the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement is way bigger than what we've been able to do. And you also have organizations such as the Dream Defenders. So if we can use some of the resources that we have in the room to connect with some of the brain power in some of those institutions and bring them to the table, I think that would be good. Something else that I've learned from Dr. Worrell is that we got to, continuously have these educational forums, and we do it well on a national level, but sometimes we don't follow up with it regionally, where we could give folks who would want to participate but can't come. So maybe if you did have another national youth reparations conference, so to speak, where we got some national youth leaders engaged and involved, and we can take that and go back out into the college campuses regionally and talk to some of those folks. And maybe if this is still a viable entity, there's the National Council of Black Studies. I think if we can try to connect with some of those students as well, but it has to be something consistent and continuous. And the last thing I would say is that this right here, I think, will be the key to us winning some younger people around reparations, or at least changing the ideology of some younger people to see that we need to be involved in this. And if we can create a social media campaign where we can see this on our smartphones, on our tablets, on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and whatever is about to pop up next week in terms of social media, we'll be able to do that and tie it to another petition around reparations, or at a bare minimum tie it to a petition in support of House Resolution 40. At least we can give them something tangible to work with. But I think if we did have a social media campaign, that we can start to reach some of the younger people where they're at, because they may not come to York College on a Friday or a Saturday, but they're on their smartphone 3 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, watching Scandal, and they tweet about that all day long. So we can create a social media campaign around reparations for younger folks. I think that'll be another way to engage them. Thank you.
Let me just, as I said before, because I forgot to look to my right and my left, we have 3 scholars who are part of this panel as well. So once you have all finished, we're going to ask you for your reflections on what you've heard so far. We're going to ask our 3 scholars, Dr. Joyce King, Dr. Franklin, and Devoted Desir, after the commissioners have spoken, to offer brief reflections as well, and then we'll have the Q&A. Cam. Okay.
All right, thank you. I too must ask permission for the elders to speak, to continue. Ashe. And Cobra really welcomes the tribute paid to us as far as the work that was done in the past, but we want to be here today to contribute to the work that's going on in the future. In 1994, there was the historic Brown versus the Board of Education case that stated that education in America, separate but equal, separate was inherently unequal in the education in America, that segregation was wrong. After that decision, it changed nothing as far as education for African people. It took another 3 years for Congress to come out with some type of legislation to desegregate the schools, and then another 10 years of enforcement of the legislation. The National Guard had to go into some states. The U.S. Marshals had to go into some states to desegregate the schools. So what we learned from that is that you can have a law on the book, but it's going to take enforcement to actually make a change. In 2001, at the World Conference Against Racism, we got a declaration that primarily stated that what had took place during the period of enslavement, the slave trade, colonialism, etc., were crimes against humanity. That was the international declaration, and it settled the issue as far as what took place among, to people of African descent. However, nothing has changed in regards to the obligation on behalf of those who have enslaved us or who criminally injured us. Nothing has happened as far as them meeting their obligation to assist in our repair, although this international declaration is there. So in COBRA, we hold that just like the Brown versus Board of Education decision that had to be enforced, that we too, as Africans, must enforce our human right to be repaired. And we're calling this new model of struggle, this new mode of activism, reparations enforcement. We have to enforce this we can enforce this by what the CARICOM community is doing, calling these nations criminal in their actions and with the threat to take them to the international court, force them to the negotiation table. That's reparations enforcement. What our brothers and sisters have done in Zimbabwe, utilizing the Durban Declaration that colonialism was crime against humanity, taking back their land and giving that land and putting that land into the hands of over 300,000 farmers, is reparations enforcement. What they're doing with the mines in Zimbabwe is reparations enforcement. They're enforcing this human right to be repaired that the Durban Declaration and Program of Action has declared for people of African descent. In America, how do we enforce our human right to be repaired? We can utilize the method of our brothers and sisters in Brazil, who had a government that had strategic individuals who then put past legislation to alter the conditions of people of African descent in Brazil. Or we can utilize our direct action mode of struggle that we've utilized in the 60s and 70s to bring corporations and institutions to bear. We know the corporations. There's been tremendous amount of research on what corporations have injured African people. We know the institutions, educational institutions, hospitals, other type of learning institutions, etc. We know those institutions that have criminally injured our ancestors. We know the families, as Dr. Beckel stated. We know the research is there. But we have to amass mass action, direct action campaigns to what we call damage the brand. If you damage the brand, you can force some type of repair. We're looking at how do we fund the reparations movement going forward. Right. We have to strategically attack these institutions, develop a direct action campaign against them to damage their brand, to weaken their brand, because we know in America, brand has value. When you attack the brand of a corporation, you force them to engage in negotiation tactics or negotiation efforts with you. And that's what we'll see going forward.
That's right.
The reparations movement, what we call in reparations enforcement, may not bring about resources for development for all African people at the same time. If there's a corporation in a particular city and you have an ability to go after that particular corporation, then those people of African descent in that city will benefit. And hopefully we'll develop a national fund where we have these individual victories. We can also tailor resources to the national fund where we can engage in national repair policies and practices. But we have to look at reparations activism in a different light, based on the fact that these governments, these institutions, these families are criminal entities coming out of the Durban Declaration and Durban Declaration and Program of Action at the World Conference Against Racism. Now we hold up.
We won't get through it if we continue. So
for sure, I'm just gonna say this last point and I'm gonna pass on. We hold up this image of a brother by the name of Gordon. On the back table in the reference area, there's an image of a brother whose back is turned to us, and he has these whips, these keloids of scars that are on his back. He got this beating at the hands of an enslaver. It took him 2 months to heal. After he healed, he escaped the plantation. He found his way to a Union Army camp, where he immediately joined the Union Army to assist in the freeing of 400,000 African people. Shortly after he joined the Army, he was appointed as a scout, and he was captured, tied to a post, and beaten a second time and left for dead. Fortunately, Gordon made his way back to the Union Army camp, and as a sergeant, 2-3 months later, he led or participated in the first all-African battle victory of the Civil War. It is that type of spirit of reparation and foresight that we must take upon ourselves as we move this campaign forward. In the spirit of Gordon, COBRA welcomes the opportunity to participate in the National African American Reparations Commission.
Thank you very much. To Roger and Sister Nkechi, in fact, it's a nice segue because Cam referenced these institutions that could be sued. He talked about them being challenged in terms of reparations enforcement with mass action, but certainly there's been a strategy to do it in relationship to litigation. So pointedly, the question is, what happened to those strategies, and are there new avenues that you envision that could be helpful in terms of the legal strategies? And in some ways, how might that also inform what's happening with the Caribbean legal team as they move forward?
Well, good afternoon.
Yeah, I guess we do have to really, I apologize, I'm criminal too. I mean, you got to get right into the microphones.
Just historically, in 2002, and we have to mention the sister's name, Deidre Farmer Paleman, was a catalyst for lawsuits, who was a friend of mine, former law partner over there from St. Vincent, Jomo Thomas. We filed lawsuits against major U.S. corporations in finance, transportation, insurance, tobacco, charging them with unjust enrichment. Basically, the essence of the lawsuits were that they owed their current existence to the profits they made from the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. Now they're all legitimate now. J.P. Morgan Chase, New York Life have nice commercials and everything, but they're built on blood money. And so the basis of those lawsuits was simply that, to identify them, to tie them to that, and we filed it first in 2 districts in New York, and then they were filed in New Jersey, Texas, Illinois, Louisiana, California. The federal courts consolidated all those cases as a class action. We were hoping it would be in New York because that was our base. They consolidated it in Chicago. And in Chicago, which is a very pro-business circuit, and it was put under a judge who had been appointed by Reagan. So it was clear from jump, we knew we had a lot of hurdles to jump, but that they were making it even more difficult. Eventually, and we were very clear that there are always limitations in the legal system. The legal system is not set up to defeat itself. The United States government does not set up a legal system that's going to make the United States government or its corporations responsible for crimes they committed. But with that, the process of doing that is to push the envelope, is to educate our community to how far it can go and the importance of their participation. When we were in Chicago, and I have to say this, Reverend Wright welcomed our legal team, had us speak to the church. His congregation were the ones, whenever we were in court, were always there, and that was key in terms of continuing to push the issue. So his props to do that. Eventually, what happened was what we thought was going to happen. The case was dismissed, it went on appeal, and the case was dismissed, basically, the judge dismissed it on every ground he thought he could, like standing, which is basically, you can't show the connection between the plaintiff whose name this is filed in and their relationship to whatever plantation or corporation that J.P. Morgan held, or that Aetna or New York Life or AIG financed, so that you couldn't show that connection. So standing is a key element in terms of the case. The Court of Appeals basically dismissed it on that, which means that in terms of where we have to go to redo this is people go back to those Bibles that they have that list where their ancestors were and what plantations they worked on. He dismissed it on a political question ground, that this is a political question and the courts do not deal with political questions, they have to be resolved in the Congress. Dismissed it on statute of limitations, that folks should have brought it back at the time when they had no concept of what corporations did anything to them when they had just gotten off the plantation. So basically it was set up in a way that they were not going to let us have it. But what it did, what the lawsuits did, was catalyze the discussion because it got a lot of publicity. And people began to talk about reparations. And the idea always was that if our community is educated, an educated community can apply the pressure that will force the system to deal with the demand. And so that discussion went on. There were discussions on campuses, in churches. A number of municipalities passed legislation around the country saying that you're going to do business with Chicago or Philadelphia or California, you've got to disclose to us what ties your company had to the slave trade. And your failure to do so means you don't get the business. So it then provided us with more information. So those cases are basically have been dismissed. At this point, we can revisit it. And let me just say this. The Japanese internment, the Jews who received money because of things that were stolen by the Nazis, they were in court. They were not resolved in court. They were resolved by a settlement or by legislation, but it was the court thing that pushed it. We should not put all our hopes in the court. We have to know that the pressure has got to come from our base, and that's what we've got to focus on.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Attorney Roger Wareham. He's absolutely correct. We cannot put all of our eggs in one basket. We're talking about a comprehensive, multifaceted struggle. He talked about the legal cases and the obstacles and barriers with respect to sovereign immunity, i.e. the U.S. has not consented to be sued, so as a result it cannot be sued in their own courts of law. That's one claim that was one of the case in 1995, reparations case, Cato versus United States. The other one, statute of limitations. You sat too long on your claim. There are defenses to some of these, such as there's a continuing injury that lasts down through today. But you know, they don't want to hear about any of those things. Standing, you know, who is the person bringing this claim, and is that claim too attenuated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So back in the early days, Cobra had a litigation committee that looked at each of those obstacles and barriers, brought together lawyers and academicians and psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers and the like. I know Brother Lenny Dunstan and Ross and all folk were a part of this to see just how we could overcome some of those obstacles, and looked at specific injury areas such as what was talked about today, criminal justice, areas with respect to health disparities, areas with respect to economic issues, areas with respect to cultural issues and the like. That lawsuit never actually was filed, but in their wake there were several others. But one of the things I want to raise that many times, I don't know whether people just don't know about it or just don't make the connection, but in 1988, when President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which was the act which granted reparations to the Japanese Americans, it was based on a number of different findings. Number one was an apology from the United States government to those who were interned during World War II. It authorized payment of $20,000 to each Japanese American detention camp survivor, a $1.5 million trust fund to be used to educate Americans about the suffering of the Japanese. But this fourth one is the one I want to mention here that we really need to look at. They issued a pardon to all of those who resisted detention camp internment. A pardon. We're talking about issues dealing with political prisoners and prisoners of war that we have right here in our own country, the United States, which are not acknowledged by the United States government, and as a result, it's not necessarily known throughout the world. So that is another very valid basis and claim for reparations. That's a pardon for all those. So if anyone's interested in doing any more specific of strategy around that. I think that's an area that has not gotten a lot of attention. Thank you.
And Ron, let me just add one very quick point. One of the reasons why we struggle in Durban for a declaration of the transatlantic slave trade as a crime against humanity is it eliminates the statute of limitations argument. Now, the United States is going to say it's not bound by international law, but that's an opening for us to be able to do that.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've been joined by Danny Glover. I guess he'll be joining us soon. He'll be at the table. Next, Yvette Modestine.
Greetings, everyone. Saludos, bienvenidos. Lifting the voices of the ancestors who have guided us to be here. I'm going to borrow from you, Sir Hillary, with your whole acting piece. So to speak to the complexity of what this is all about. Act 1, I am a grandchild of Bajan, Jamaican, and Martinican grandparents who got on a ship and landed in Panama. Act 2, we have people of African descent who were already in Panama and developed and created this country, which President Obama is now taking in. Part 2 of that is these Afro-Caribbean grandparents who built what I think is one of the wonders of the world, the Panama Canal. Panama has gained his political status and economic status based on what these men built. The U.S. gained its economic status based on what these Caribbean men built. And within that, these Caribbean men had to deal with U.S. imperialism, colonialism, while they were imposed Jim Crow laws in Panama, where we were segregated and they were paid less, and men and women, they were paid less as silvermen. So that's Act 2, Part 1 and 2. Act 3 is how do we then make the connection of U.S. imperialism inside this country, but also the laws that they imposed in other countries that created the division of labor and economics in other countries outside of the U.S. Pause for a minute, which I have not heard today enough of, is the gender gap. Latin America and the Caribbean has the greatest gender gap and ethnic and racial gap anywhere. So it's time for us to speak to the sexual division of labor that exists in these countries. So I leave on the table, how do we engage, if we really are thinking about a global reparation movement, is making the connection to all these stories, and how do we see ourselves in each other and gain the political and economic status that we also deserve.
All right, okay. Well, we just want to acknowledge that we've been joined by Danny Glover. He'll be the keynote speaker tonight in the tribute to the Honorable John Conyers, Dean of the Congressional Black Caucus. Sister Ivor Carruthers, and Sister Ivor, while you're at it, would you say a word too about, because in Illinois, you and Conrad and others did a phenomenal study. You convened a commission as well in Illinois, right? So would you do both of those things in a brief sonnet or synopsis, or I guess whatever?
So one of the
Speak right into the mic,
ways in which we are working has to do with creating educational awareness and consciousness, particularly grounded in the faith community. And to do that, that connects the process and the consequences of historical memory and the loss of historical memory connected to historical trauma. And so I don't want to lose the both constructs of reparations, but as Sir Hillary mentioned, as well as genocide. Because I think that the genocide also needs to be spoken to in both the context of memory, which we now know from the neurosciences is cellular. And so it is passed down through generations, Which brings me then to another point that I want to put on the table, which is a couple of weeks ago we were convened by the Tuskegee Center for Bioethics to raise the questions about the implications of biogenetic engineering. And when we think about these issues in relationship to the foundation of land and the importance of land in terms of our conversations, I think we cannot avoid raising the question of the implications of biogenetic engineering as it relates to two areas. One is they have now announced that they can totally interrupt and transform what is called the human germ line, which means that genetic engineering has taken us to a point where there can be total modification. Indigenous people who were present are using the conventions of the United Nations in this country, Native American people, to raise questions about what that looks like for them in terms of calls for reparations around the Human Genome Project and what's happened to their genes. The other part of that is that that same technology is now being used and implemented in terms of agricultural seeds. And so terminator seeds are also a part of this trajectory of genocide, which is going to cut us off at the pass and needs to be embedded in our conversations for the issue of reparations. And I would think that underneath all of that is a theological kind of understanding that we must bring to bear in terms of what kind of world we're trying to create. And so I would invite Dr. Wright to maybe speak to that. Oh, you want me to speak on the transatlantic slave trade? Essentially, what happened is that the state of Illinois, largely under Conrad's energy and orchestration, was able to replicate the federal bill, and we were convened, commissioned, and empowered to study the impact of the transatlantic slave trade on the history of Illinois. And as a result of that, we came away with about 8 very specific recommendations which we have been trying to implement, and some of them include, for example, the development of a historical marker program which would, in the process, get people engaged around truth and reparative justice hearings at the ground level in order for us to then have a national marker program that would significantly mark our points of resistance as well as our points of trauma.
Thank you very much. As the chair's prerogative, what I'm going to do is have actually Dr. Wright close us out on that note, because I do want to get, and we're interacting, so I think we're in consensus on that. So I want him to come at the end to sort of give us a kind of that theological overlay.
We are not in consensus. I was saying we have 3 scholars, conversation between the CARICOM and us, and questions, and the bus leaves 1 hour from now.
All right. Okay, so now I want to, and we're an hour late, and so that's the other thing that's compressing us. But I want to go first to Dr. Joyce King, who is at my right for reflections, and again, unfortunately, briefer than perhaps we'd like, but nonetheless, your intervention.
Thank you very much. I am going to try to be very brief. First thing I want to say is, I'm Joyce King. I hold the Benjamin E. Mays Endowed Chair at Georgia State University, and I'm really speaking out of my close affiliation with Asa Hilliard, who was in the same department with me, my teacher and my friend. I'm also the president of the American Educational Research Association. That's 26,000 educators, faculty members, researchers around the world, and our theme for this year is Toward Justice. So we are taking up many of these questions in a quiet way, but in a way that is allowing us also to look for allies. And one of the points about allies that I want to make, and then I'll just finish up with some comments about education and the main message that Asa left, I think, for me. Allies, did you know that at the end of President Obama's first year in office, in 2009, a case brought by a Native American woman named Eloise Cobell resulted in a $4 billion settlement of reparations. So we need to be in communication with allies who can recognize what our struggle is about in relation to their struggle, because all necks are on the line. The next thing I would say about education, Asa always said we do not start our story with slavery. So while we're talking about reparations, we also have to reconnect to our human right to be who we are, know who we are, and know what has been taken from us. Yes, we've lost land, we've lost wealth, but we've also lost memory that will connect us as people, African people, all around the world. And one of the ways that I've dealt with that in my own research, I don't have time to go into it, but we did an after-school program called the Songhai Club. You know the history, Ghana, Mali, Songhai. Well, we took Songhai all the way back to the Nile, then to the Niger, and to the neighborhood. So the children began to research their own neighborhood trajectory and understand why does our neighborhood look the way it looks today. And that's very empowering in that it gives us back our identity as African people. And we use the framework of Dr. Edward Robinson, the late Edward Robinson from Philadelphia, who taught us that we are the culmination of the journey of the Songhai people. So from east to west, all the way to the Americas, and the point is that our education system is being taken away from us. We are even losing the opportunity to educate our children as schools are being closed down all over the country, taken over, no democracy, no input. And so we need to add to the formula of reparations current deprivations that will prevent us from working in concert as a people and with allies. And the last thing I would like to say is my family came out of the South. My mother's people came from Louisiana, followed the Red River up through Arkansas to Oklahoma. And the struggle in our family was to actually get work, to be able to work.